sometimes there are important stories out there. And sometimes tragedies that we just can't turn away from.
Yeah. And today's story, I think, is one of those.
Right. It's a tough one. We're talking about Debrina Kawam, a 57-year-old woman who was tragically killed on a New York City subway train. Just a few days before Christmas, actually, she was set on fire. And the suspect in the case is an undocumented immigrant with a history of mental health issues. I mean, it's a story that has definitely sparked a lot of fear and anger. I mean, rightfully so.
Yeah.
But it's also a story that demands that we look beyond those headlines, right? And really try to understand the complexities of this story, the issues that are at play here.
Absolutely. We've got a lot to untangle in this story. Homelessness, mental health, public safety, and immigration. All of those things intersect in this case. And it would be so easy to jump to conclusions, but our goal today is to just delve deeper, examine the facts and try to make sense of this horrific event.
Right. So let's start with Debrina. What do we know about her life leading up to this?
Well, from what we've gathered, it sounds like Debrina's life was marked by quite a bit of hardship. I mean, she'd been living in shelters in New York City since September. And even before that, she'd faced years of, financial struggles. Apparently, she even declared bankruptcy back in 2008 with debts reaching $100,000.
Wow. It sounds like she was really struggling, struggling to stay afloat. I mean, is there anything, did they find out anything else about her?
Well, identifying her was a challenge because of her injuries, but authorities were eventually able to confirm her identity using, fingerprint analysis.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a pretty grim reminder of how vulnerable people experiencing homelessness can be.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then there's the subway system, right? Which has become a shelter for so many people experiencing homelessness. And
yeah.
That's where Debrina's story really intersects with this larger issue, I think.
Absolutely. And it's something that a lot of people are talking about. I mean, we even found a Reddit thread where people were discussing this, growing number of homeless individuals seeking shelter in the subways.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and there were concerns about safety and hygiene, obviously, but there are also these, expressions of compassion and a desire for solutions.
Oh, that's good. I mean, it's definitely a complex issue, so it's good to see that there are at least some people out there with, compassion. One thing that stood out to me, though, in that Reddit thread, there was a comment from a former social worker, and he was pointing out that a lot of chronically homeless individuals in the subway system are dealing with untreated mental illness. A lot of times it's exacerbated by drug or alcohol use too.
Right, and that's such a crucial point to make. It really highlights that, urgent need for comprehensive solutions that actually address the root causes of homelessness. I mean, we're talking about the lack of affordable housing, insufficient mental health care, the cycle of poverty, all these things.
Yeah, it's a lot. And this is where I think the conversation gets even more complicated because the suspect, in Debrina's case, Sebastian Zapeta-Calil, adds a whole other layer to this whole story.
He does. What we know so far is that Sebastian is an undocumented immigrant from Guatemala, and he's got a history of mental health issues and drug use. His roommate at the homeless shelter actually described him as a nice guy who was often drunk, but, generally harmless. But he also mentioned that Sebastian would sometimes speak to imaginary people, which suggests maybe he struggles with psychosis or delusions or something like that.
Oh, wow. That's a disturbing detail for sure. I mean, it definitely paints a picture of a man struggling with his own demons, I guess you could say. And it also, to me, it underscores the importance of, avoiding sweeping generalizations about immigrants, or
Yeah.
people experiencing homelessness, right?
Exactly. This isn't about labeling entire groups. It's about trying to understand the circumstances that led us here. I mean, and the systemic failures that contributed to this tragedy.
Absolutely. So let's talk about immigration in New York City in general. I mean, this case has sparked a lot of debate, obviously, about the city's immigration policies. And frankly, it's hard not to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all.
Yeah. It's a huge issue. I think to get a better handle on this, we have a report here from New York City Comptroller Brad Lander. The report is titled Facts Not Fear, and it offers some really useful data and insights, I think.
Oh, okay. Facts, not fear. I like that. I'm ready for some facts because we hear so much rhetoric about immigration. It's hard to sort out, what's real and what's not.
Right. So I think one of the key takeaways from this report is that, immigrants are essential to New York City's economy and the city's workforce. I mean, they make up a significant portion of the labor force in some key industries like construction, healthcare, and hospitality.
That makes sense. I mean, New York's always been this, melting pot, and immigrants have always been a vital part of the city.
Absolutely. And this report emphasizes that while the current influx of immigrants, is significant, it's really not unprecedented. I mean, the U.S., especially New York City, has seen, comparable or even larger waves of immigration throughout history.
So, is this narrative that, we hear so much that immigration is out of control, is that not entirely true?
Well, according to the data, not really. I mean, the growth of the immigrant population in the U.S. has actually been slower in recent years compared to past decades.
Oh, interesting. It feels like we're constantly bombarded with these messages about how immigration is a problem,
Yeah.
like it's a burden on society.
Yeah, and that's a common misconception, and it's something that this report, directly challenges. I mean, it presents data about the economic contributions that immigrants make. They pay taxes, they start businesses, they create jobs, and they contribute to the cultural richness of the city.
Okay, so it seems like this facts not fear report is sort of a counter argument to a lot of the anti-immigration rhetoric that's out there.
It is, and it's a good reminder that sound policy decisions should be based on evidence, not on, fear or prejudice.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we try to make sense of this complicated story, I think it's important for us to maybe shift our focus a little bit, to Sebastian Zapeta-Calil, the man who is accused of setting Debrina Kawam on fire.
Right, and it's important to remember, of course, that we can never, condone his actions, but I think we need to approach this part of the conversation, carefully. We need to try to understand the things that might contributed to his actions. We know that he's an undocumented immigrant from Guatemala, and his story is really part of this, larger pattern of migration from Central America to the U.S.
It is, and to really understand Sebastian's, his journey, I think we need to understand those historical and contemporary forces that are driving migration from Guatemala in the first place.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What can you tell me about Guatemala and why people might be leaving? What are those conditions that would lead someone to make such a dangerous and desperate journey?
Well, Guatemala has a pretty long and troubled history. It's a country that's been deeply affected by political instability, violence, and poverty. I mean, they've endured civil war, they've had natural disasters, and persistent economic hardship. It's been a lot.
Yeah, I'm looking at some information here from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAI. They've been working in Guatemala for decades, focusing on development and humanitarian aid. I bet they have some insights into the challenges that Guatemala is facing.
They do. I mean, USAI has been on the ground there for a long time, and their research has, pointed to some of the key drivers of what they're calling irregular migration, which just means migration without legal documentation.
Okay, irregular migration. So what are some of those key drivers? What's pushing people to leave Guatemala?
Well, one major factor, probably the biggest one, honestly, is the lack of economic opportunities. A staggering 59% of Guatemalans live below the poverty line, which means they're struggling to even meet their basic needs.
Wow, 59%. That's pretty shocking. No wonder people are looking for a better life somewhere else. I mean, for a lot of people, it's a matter of survival.
Yeah, it is, and USAID's research really backs that up. They found that 77% of Guatemalans who say they want to migrate, they do so for economic reasons. They're hoping to find jobs to support themselves and their families.
So it's not just about fleeing danger. It's also about trying to create a better life, a decent life, a chance to escape poverty and build a future.
Exactly. But it's not just about economic hardship, though. USAID also points to these pervasive problems of extortion, crime, and violence in Guatemala as reasons why people are leaving.
Yeah, and that's just heartbreaking. It sounds like people are caught in a really desperate situation.
They are. And these issues are all, interconnected. Poverty makes people more vulnerable to crime and exploitation, and violence and instability make it almost impossible to escape poverty.
It's like this vicious cycle. And I'm guessing corruption plays a big role in all this too, right?
Absolutely. Corruption it erodes trust in the government, and in institutions. It makes people feel powerless and hopeless, especially when they face injustice.
Right. Looking at USAID's data here, I mean, it's clear that they're seeing this direct link between these issues. and migration. They're saying that 43% of reported extortions, they happen in these high migration areas. And the victims of extortion, they're 54% more likely to consider migrating.
Right, because people are being pushed out of their communities, because they're afraid, because they don't feel safe. They're fleeing for their lives and for their futures.
And it's not just extortion either. They're saying 45% of Guatemalans say that insecurity is like the most serious problem in the country. And people who are victims of crime, they're 48% more likely to migrate.
It's tragic, really. People are having to leave everything they know and love simply because they don't feel safe.
The data on corruption is it's pretty alarming too. USAID says that 61% of Guatemalans think that there's like widespread corruption, among public officials, and people who've experienced corruption themselves. They're 83% more likely to consider migrating.
Right. It's like they've just lost faith in their government's ability to protect them, to provide for their basic needs. They feel abandoned. They feel like they have no choice but to try to find a better life somewhere else, even if it means risking everything.
So we're seeing a pretty clear pattern here. People are leaving Guatemala because they're desperate for economic opportunities. They're fleeing violence and extortion, and they're disillusioned by corruption. These are pretty powerful push factors, pushing people out of their homes and towards this really perilous journey north.
You got it. And I think it's essential to understand these push factors when we consider the journey of someone like Sebastian Zapeta-Calil.
Right. And we know that he arrived in the U.S. sometime before 2018. That's when he was deported after crossing the border illegally. But then he came back, which brings us to this whole conversation about immigration policy and border security. It's a conversation that's always so full of strong opinions and complex realities.
It is, and it's important to recognize that there are a lot of different viewpoints on how to deal with undocumented immigration. Some people argue for like stricter border enforcement, and more deportations. They think that'll act as a deterrent.
Right. While others argue for more humane policies, right? Policies that focus on addressing the root causes of migration and maybe providing pathways to legalization. But it often feels like it's more about politics than about finding solutions that are both practical and humane.
That's true. And like we saw in that Facts Not Fear report, policies that are just aimed at deterring asylum seekers, they've never really worked.
Yeah, it makes sense that if people are fleeing for their lives or if they're just desperate for a chance at a future, they're going to find a way no matter what, right? I mean, they're being driven by forces that are a lot, stronger than border security.
Exactly, and that's why a lot of advocates believe that the best way to reduce what they call irregular migration is to actually address the underlying issues, the issues that are pushing people out of their home countries.
Okay, so instead of just focusing on border security, we should be investing in development and humanitarian aid.
Yep.
Promote economic growth in Central America, and work to combat corruption and violence at the source.
That's the argument. Yeah, it's a complicated issue for sure. There are no easy answers. But it's a conversation that we need to be having. If we really want to understand what's shaping these migration patterns and the lives of individuals like Sebastian.
Right. Okay. So let's bring this back to Sebastian's story. We know that he ended up at a homeless shelter in Brooklyn, and he was sharing a room with a man named Eric Robinson.
Right. And Robinson's account of Sebastian actually gives us some pretty valuable insight into his mental state and his behavior. He described him as being generally quiet and friendly. He said he was a nice guy, but he also said that Sebastian would often speak to imaginary people.
Yeah, that's a detail that stood out to me too. It sounds like Sebastian was really struggling with his mental health. Maybe he was experiencing psychosis or delusions. Those are conditions that can, really distort someone's perception of reality.
Right, and it's important to remember that mental illness can manifest in a lot of different ways, and not everyone who experiences mental health challenges is going to become, violent or dangerous.
Of course, but in Sebastian's case, it seems like his mental health struggles might have been made worse by his drinking.
Yeah.
Maybe that created kind of a dangerous and volatile combination.
Yeah, Robinson did say that Sebastian would. he would often come back to the shelter drunk. And it's possible that his behavior became more erratic and unpredictable when he was under the influence.
Yeah. And tragically, it seems like this combination of mental illness and substance abuse and just a lack of support. I mean, it seems like all that might have played a role in what happened to Debrina Kawam.
Yeah, it's a sad reminder that untreated mental illness, especially when it's combined with substance abuse, it can have devastating consequences, not just for the person who's struggling, but for other people as well.
Right. And it really raises some tough questions about the availability of, mental health services and how accessible those services are for vulnerable populations, especially, people who are experiencing homelessness and people who are undocumented.
It does. It really highlights the need for more, more compassionate and more effective ways to intervene. We need to find ways to address both mental health and substance abuse issues, and recognize that those are complex. They're intertwined, and they require solutions that are just as complex.
Okay, so Sebastian's story, I mean, it's complicated, right? It's shaped by, by poverty, by violence, by displacement in his home country, and all of that was compounded by mental health struggles and substance abuse here in the U.S. It's a story that I think really speaks to the urgent need for systemic change. We need a more humane approach to addressing all these interconnected issues.
We do, and while what he did was undeniably horrific, I think it's important to avoid painting him as some kind of monster. We can't use his case to demonize whole groups of people, whether it's immigrants or people experiencing homelessness.
Right. We need to see him as an individual. Right.
Yeah.
A human being who's failed by multiple systems. His story is a tragedy. I mean, it's a tragedy on so many levels, and it's a story that we as a society need to learn from. But I think maybe it's time to move beyond Sebastian's individual story and look at the bigger picture. What are the systemic failures that that brought us to this point, and what can we actually do to create a system that's more just and more compassionate for everybody? We've spent a lot of time talking about Debrina Kawam and Sebastian Zapeta-Calil, and we've talked about homelessness, mental health, and immigration in New York. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep thinking, where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And there are no easy answers. But I think maybe the first step is just admitting that, if we want real solutions, we have to address the root causes of these problems. We can't just keep reacting to the symptoms, right?
So we're talking about tackling things like poverty, the lack of affordable housing, inadequate mental health care, substance abuse. We need to address the systems, the inequalities that allow these problems to just keep happening.
Yeah, exactly. We can't just keep, slapping Band-Aids on these deep wounds. We need to go deeper. We need to address the things that are creating and perpetuating these cycles of hardship.
Okay, so let's start with mental health services. I mean, we talked about the need for more funding, but what does that actually look like? What does that mean?
Well, it means more than just, adding more beds to psych hospitals, right? I think we need a more holistic approach. We need to prioritize, community-based services, preventative care, and really strong support systems for people who are, transitioning out of institutions.
So meeting people where they are, basically, providing care that's tailored to their individual needs, and I think crucially, making sure that those services are available to everyone, no matter their immigration status or their financial situation.
Exactly. We can't have a system that that excludes the most vulnerable people.
Right. And speaking of exclusion, we can't ignore the affordable housing crisis in New York. I mean, it's a major driver of homelessness. It's forcing people to make these impossible choices.
Absolutely. When there aren't enough affordable housing options, it puts so much pressure on individuals and families, and for some people it means living on the streets or seeking shelter in the subway.
We saw some comments in that Reddit thread we were talking about, and some people were basically blaming homeless people for choosing to sleep in the subways. But the reality is, a lot of them they don't have anywhere else to go.
Yeah, I think it's really important to challenge those assumptions and remember that homelessness is usually the result of systemic failures. It's not about personal choices.
Okay, so how do we even start to address this affordable housing crisis? I mean, it just seems so huge.
It is a big problem, yeah. But it's not impossible to solve. I think we need We need a multi-pronged approach. We need to increase the supply of affordable housing. We need to strengthen tenants' rights, and we need to provide, rental assistance to people who are struggling.
And that means, that policymakers have to, they have to actually make this a priority. They have to actually invest in programs that support, low-income families and individuals.
Right. It's about making safe, decent, and affordable housing a right. It's not a privilege.
Right, right. And we also can't forget about, poverty in general. We have to address income inequality, create more opportunities for, for people to move up, economically. Everyone should have a chance to thrive.
Absolutely. We need to think bigger than just, short-term fixes. We need to dismantle the structures that are keeping people, trapped in poverty.
Okay. So we're talking about things like raising the minimum wage, investing in, job training programs, providing access to quality education, supporting, small businesses and entrepreneurs.
Exactly. We need to create a society where everyone, has a shot at a decent life, where everyone has a chance to contribute and, and reach their full potential.
Right. And we can't forget about, the role of substance abuse in all of this. We know Sebastian Zapeta-Calil struggled with alcohol, and it seems like that, that played a part in his actions.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, it's, substance abuse is a way to cope with trauma, with mental illness, with, just overwhelming circumstances in their lives. I think we need to approach addiction with compassion.
So we need to move away from, from this idea of criminalizing addiction and focus more on treatment and rehabilitation.
Exactly. We need to make sure people can get the help they need, to get sober, to rebuild their lives.
And I think we also have to, challenge the stigma around addiction.
Yeah.
We need to build a culture that's more supportive of people in recovery.
Yeah. We need to shift our focus from punishment to, to healing.
Okay. We've talked about a lot of challenges and we've talked about some potential solutions, but how do we actually, make these changes happen? I mean, it feels so daunting.
It can feel overwhelming, but we can't let that, paralyze us. Change starts with each of us, We can't sit around and wait for someone else to fix these problems. We have to, we have to get involved. We have to speak up, and we have to hold our leaders accountable.
So we're talking about things like voting for, for candidates who support these issues, contacting our elected officials, advocating for change within our own communities, supporting organizations that are, that are doing this work.
Exactly. There are so many incredible groups out there that are, that are helping people experiencing homelessness, that are fighting for immigrants' rights, that are working for, social justice. And we need to support their work, however we can.
Right. And what about just, the small things, the everyday things? Can we make a difference just in the way we, the way we live our lives and interact with other people?
Of course we can. I mean, we can challenge our own biases, right? We can learn more about these issues. We can have conversations with people, even people who have, different views than our own. We can be respectful.
Yeah. And we can also choose to support businesses and organizations that, that share our values. Everything we do, every choice we make, it has an impact.
That's the point. We have to recognize that we have the power to make a difference.
I think Debrina Kawam's story, as awful as it is, it's a powerful call to action.
Yeah.
Right. It forces us to really look at these uncomfortable truths and demand better. We have to demand better for our communities.
It does. It reminds us that we can't ignore the suffering around us. We all have a responsibility to try to create a society where everyone, where everyone has the chance to live a safe, healthy, and fulfilling life.
Yeah, a society that truly values the lives of all its members, no matter their circumstances.
Exactly. That's the kind of world we need to build. And that work starts now.
Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive. It's been a tough one for sure. It's been full of, difficult truths and realities that are hard to face. But I hope it's also been, a chance to learn and to reflect.
I hope so too. And more importantly, I hope it inspires our listeners to take action.
Right. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll keep exploring these issues, and we hope you'll join us again for future conversations.
And thank you for listening.